I often get asked by a number of my pupils, when is the best time to try a new opening? Because when you try a new opening, you're not really familiar with the positions that arise, and you can often get unstuck against a strong player in this manner. Here we see a game where Karjakin was black against Anton Korobov, also a fellow Ukrainian player, and it was played in the Governor's Cup in 2001. So again, just 11 years old. But here we see the position on the board where Karjakin has actually managed to struggle to this bad endgame from a Stonewall Dutch. The reason why I mentioned the opening was because Karjakin's not usually playing the Stonewall Dutch at that time, and I believe he tried it just to add a sort of element of solidity to his opening repertoire. What's happened though is that it's stunted his tactical ability a little bit in this game, and he hasn't really had any chance to do anything. So he's managed to get to this position, and he's clearly worse. The reason why is because, as we mentioned in a previous endgame chapter, how you should always put your bishop on or have you put your pawns on the opposite colour square of your bishop. Here we see white with practically all of his pawns on black squares with a white squared bishop. On the other hand, the black bishop is completely hemmed in by all of its pawns. In fact, every single one of black's pawns is on a light square. So it's clear that despite the solid nature of black's position, he's completely planless really. And the only move he can try is this b4 break, and we're going to talk about that later on in this game. But at the moment, it's clear that white is better. But how can white break through? And I think Korobov's manner of planning in this endgame was of a very high level. So he started quite simply with king f2, bringing the king in. We've always talked about bringing the king in the endgame, and especially since black is unable to play this b4 move. Can you see why? The point is that rook b3 will win the pawn on b4 due to the skewer onto the rook on b8. So black, if he cannot play b4, well, he's completely devoid of any play, so he tried king f8. Still though, white has to be very careful to always watch out for this b4 pawn break, because if he's not careful, that black rook can come in onto b4 and attack the pawn on d4. But at the moment, white's got everything covered. So h3, and the idea is to gain space on the king side. When you've got a space advantage, as white has, what I mean by that is your pieces are further up the board. The white pawn formation is far further forward than black's, if you can see, just like this, for example. And that gives white a degree of extra space, which means they can use that space to their advantage by being able to maneuver your pieces in and around your own camp. So here we see white decide, well, I'm going to go with my king on this trek towards the king side. Now, that turns out to be quite an important idea in this endgame for white. Could black stop that? Well, he certainly can't play g5, but after bishop c8, king h4, it was possible for Karjakin to play h6. But now, this pawn formation here on the king side is slightly weakened. So it's possible for white to now return and then play this idea of h4, h5. And if we can undermine this pawn structure here, it looks like black might be in some trouble. And the reason why I say undermine is because at the moment black is very solid, but after h4, h5, for example, bishop d7, h4, if I just play a move like bishop c8, just doing nothing, h5, and now what does black do about these pawns here? I have to take. Which pawn do you think white should capture? White should actually capture this pawn on f5, because a passed pawn, a protected passed pawn, has been created in the centre, and worst of all from black's point of view, is that all of these pawns are just sitting ducks. They're just going to be able to be taken quite soon, like king h4, munch, there we go. So that's really the worst case scenario for black in this position. So after h6, king g3, I think Karjakin decided that's a little bit too dangerous, so he decided after king h4 just to play rook b7. Now what that does is entails the bishop to be able to defend the rook, which means that that rook will not be en prise in that earlier tactic. If you remember, we talked about black playing b4, and white could respond with rook b3, but now the rook is defended, so this is where white has to be exercise a little bit of caution in this position. We've talked about that before. You should never rush in the endgame. You should never rush at any stage of the game in a game of chess, and especially so in this position, because one move can be quite fatal for either side. So Rook A8, trying to sort of disrupt Black's structure here. King D7. I think he didn't want to go Bishop D7 because of Rook H8, and already we won a pawn. So King D7, but what that does is it blocks in Black's pieces in this extremely funny way. And I think actually Korobov, to his credit, had already seen the winning combination at this point, and otherwise I don't think he would have played Rook A8. It may not be apparent to us sort of lesser mortals, but there's actually a very hidden combination here for White at some moment, and you're going to see it in just a few moves. So King G5. Now that's the move White wanted to play. The king is able to go infiltrating in the Black position. I mean, King H6 would practically win the pawn on H7 if Black's not careful. So after King C7, White decided to go here. It's all part of White's little plan, and now Black played B4. Now, here comes the critical moment. Does White take that pawn, or does White have something else? Well, if we take the pawn, I think this was what Karjakin was pinning his hopes on. Suddenly, he will end up winning the D pawn. Now, of course, White can start attacking the pawn on H7, for example, Rook A7 check with a skewer, possibly by playing King G7 to attack the pawn that way. But once the D pawn falls, White's other pieces are in, well, very dangerous positions from the point of view that the Rook is now amongst them. So this wasn't really what Korobov had in mind. So after B4, he came up with a very nice combination here. A very dangerous one that needed him to calculate extremely carefully. So he played Bishop A6. Now that move in itself is fairly obvious, because if now Rook B8, I think Rook A7 check, King has to move, and we can take on B4. For example, Rook A8. So Black's strategy of B4 hasn't really worked there. However, Black can of course play B3, and this was the Karjakin's idea. The point is that now, if Bishop takes B7, we can play B2. Has Korobov blundered? Has he overlooked something? But actually, he comes up with a very nice idea. And you wouldn't have believed it from the original starting position of the endgame that Black's king can actually be caught in a mating net here. But that is exactly what happens. Because after Black queens, King to E7. And this is a fantastic sort of demonstration of how the pieces work together, even in the endgame. Because the king on E7 protects these squares, and White's plan is quite simple. White's just going to move the bishop on to A6 and play Rook C8 checkmate, and there's actually very little Black can do about it. For example, in fact he resigned here, Karjakin, but if he'd carried on, he could have played Queen E1, Bishop A6 check, not check, excuse me, Queen H4 is check, and G5. And now, Rook to C8 is going to be checkmate. And notice that we talked about Philidor's idea of putting your pawns on opposite colour square of your bishop. This is exactly one of the reasons why, because the white pieces work together very harmoniously, and it is in fact trapped Black's king here. So very well played by Korobov. I think that was a big learning lesson again for Karjakin by trying a new opening against such a strong player as Korobov, 24-70 rating. And he actually got into a lot of trouble there. He didn't really have any chances. It wasn't the style of play that he likes to play, very tactical, aggressive chess that we've seen. And he kind of lost this game with no real chances. So I think this is one of the reasons why we haven't really seen the Stonewall Dutch in his repertoire. But it's the same for all chess players. If you try a new opening, you don't really want to stick at it. You want to kind of decide whether it does suit you, and if it doesn't, you've got to get rid of it and try an opening that suits you.